we're talking
Mhm.
about the joy in horror, and I want to ask you what what was your introduction to horror, and do you think that it played a role in the happiness the genre brings you now?
Absolutely, it does. My introduction to horror was through my best friend, Keith. I gotta give him a shout out. He's my oldest friend. His It was very unusual. He got a video game, and which was unusual that his parents allowed him this video game, because I would say they'd be quite strict parents. But I also think they didn't know what this video game entailed, and it was Resident Evil Nemesis. And this whole idea, I think, for a kid who had grown up in Goosebumps books and who fairly liked them, but wasn't completely besotted with them, all those books were very insular in their stories. It was set number of children and isolated, always isolated set, and they were isolated from their adults. They were either by because the adults didn't believe anything they're saying or because of the situation itself or the setting. But the video game Resident Evil Nemesis is a zombie game, if you don't know, in a city. And it's the first probably of its kind. So it's a massive expanse in terms of the setting itself. And you're suddenly find your imagination is allowed to go completely free, with the idea of, oh, you could have this action sequence at this gas station, and you could have this. So my first experience of horror was of zombies chasing me down the streets. It was their moans, the sounds of their squashy feet. I still remember those sounds, oddly enough, like the sounds of the game in my head. They come to me, and yes, it was terrifying. It was absolutely terrifying to play the game by yourself. So it was. I couldn't do it. So I only ever played it with him in the room. But it was that sense, again, it was the sense of camaraderie that brought on, because there'd be a moment where I would get so terrified the controller would literally leap out of my hands, and he would grab onto it and take over, because say a zombie came out of the corridor at last second and was going to kill me. And so because I was so terrified. And it was that, and then he would take over, and then this game would settle down, and you would sort of remark to another, we survived that, even though you were sitting in your bedroom in Northern Ireland completely safe. So it was that sort of first kind of initial kind of, there is fear here, but it's a mimic of what the reality or a real fear could be, but it's safe and it's controlled and you can experience it. And as a kid who is growing up and perhaps is experiencing, maybe feeling outcast and feeling shunned a little bit, and maybe even experiencing bullying, for a kid like that, it was a joy to experience that emotion and not feel it wasn't personal, the fear you would feel in the schoolyard or walking down the street. So it was. So certainly there's a great joy in it, and it's that initial joy that catches you. It's like a latch. So it is. And I do think we are predisposed to what we like, and I think I was always supposed to like horror. And yeah.
Yeah, I like what you're saying too about the camaraderie part, because my experience is similar in
Mhm.
terms of growing up, and the scary books that I read. They were like scary stories to tell in the dark, scary stories for sleepovers. I mean, that's when you get with your friends, and maybe you're having a sleepover or a camp out or a get together of some sort, and you're trying to scare each other. So you're in it together, and like you said,
Yeah.
playing the video games or even watching horror movies. I mean, I will watch horror movies by myself, but
Mhm.
I like them so much more if I can watch them with somebody else.
Yes. Yes.
And
One of the highlights of my experience in horror in my life was I took my father to see It Chapter One, and I didn't
mm,
realize my dad didn't go see horror films. Now my dad is, as we describe him here, as an anorak, which is an old name for a nerd. So he would have this in-depth knowledge about movies and music, and not just like music. He would be like, the bass player in that album is that person, and they played also on this Bob Dylan. That's how Anyway, so but he never went to horror movies, and I never noticed that. So I didn't realize when I was taken to see Stephen King's the chapter one. Of that when we were in the cinema. But I think because he knew that I was such a big fan, he wanted to experience the movie with me. And there's a scene in that film, I'm going to spoil, where they have the flicking, what is it? They do the projector, and it speeds
Yep.
up and it speeds up, and then it goes dark, and then it appears. And my dad's maybe 6'2" something. He stood up in the middle of a packed cinema and screamed "Holy shit" at the screen. In full, you know, everyone is there and everyone is laughing at him at that. And that is just bliss. And that's like, you know, these people, you know, people that don't like, oh, it's too scary for me. But in that scary moment, there was such happiness and joy, because my dad had this reaction, and we were all reacting the same way, but he had this visceral reaction because he had not yet, you know, experienced as much as I had. And that's one of my favorite moments of my life.
Wow. Yeah, I can relate to a bit, because, you know, one of the memories that I have, one of the moments that I thought about was probably about 4 years ago. You know, my mom is the same way as you're describing your dad, like does not watch horror movies, you know, doesn't like scary stuff, easily scared even. But she was in town and she was visiting, and her and my stepdad were staying with me, and I don't even remember. I think my stepdad went to bed early that night, and this was back before I used to go to bed early like I do now, because I'm an old man. Really, I like to get up early in the morning and read. But back then, you know, I'd stay up until 1, 2 a.m. and she's the same way. So I was like, "Hey, do you want to watch a movie with me?" And she was like, "Sure." And so we watched Get Out. And as I was, you know, I'm very desensitized when it comes to horror. And while I was watching it, you know, scenes kept happening, and I was just like, "Oh, wow, I can't believe I got my mom to watch this with me." But then when it was over, she enjoyed it. Like, she
Oh, yeah.
really liked it, and she picked up on some of the themes and some of the messages and whatnot. And so she ended up enjoying it. And then a couple of years later, at a family gathering, with like my entire family, we watched Don't Breathe. And so, like, now that I am writing horror and whatnot, you know, my mom is, you know, some of that taboo that was associated with it isn't there anymore, and she's a little more interested. And so, yeah, that's cool that you got to experience a similar thing with your dad.